We read this morning together the story of Moses, probably somewhat familiar to many of us. Now, if I were doing a movie of the story of the Bible, I would not begin with Adam and Eve and the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They would be flashbacks. I would begin my movie with darkness, a dark screen. And then slowly, softly, you would begin to hear sounds. You would begin to hear people crying out. It would become louder and louder. And as the sounds of pain, human pain, the sound of whips on human flesh, the sounds of groaning of people who are at the very end of their physical endurance, as these sounds got louder, the screen would come alive, and you would see a mass of humanity. You would see under the unforgiving Egyptian sun a group of nobodies, people who amounted to nothing, people with no identity and with no future. They are called slaves. And you would have a moment in the movie's beginning to feel and experience something of what it must have been like to be a nobody in the ancient world, to be a slave in Egypt. And then the movie would go silent, completely silent. And the next scene would be desolation, a place of barrenness. It would be silence. And then you would see a face of a man, ordinary man, not young anymore, but still strong, but an ordinary face. And he would be watching the flocks and the herds in this barren place as he moved those flocks from place to place, trying to find some green growth for the animals. And then there would be the presence of God in this silence. It would come in the form of a bush, an ordinary bush. And it would be aflame. It would be on fire. It would be the presence of God. It would burn, but it would not be consumed. And out of that fire, out of that presence of a bush, we would hear the voice of God calling this ordinary person to the task of going back and confronting the most powerful person on earth about the condition and the letting go and the freeing up of these people. And we would, for a moment, we would be in suspense, perhaps, wondering, is this person who's being addressed by God, is this person going to say yes or not? Would it be fair to say that the future of God's salvation for the world, God's plan for the world, would it be fair to say that it hung in the balance whether Moses is going to say yes or not? Now, some people might object and say, no, that's probably not the way you should say it. Because if Moses says no, God has plan B. God's plan is not going to fail. If Moses says no, somebody else is going to say yes. Maybe? I don't know. But I do know this, that God's plan for saving the world involves people. God has no other plan to save the world, to renew the world, to make the world new again, a new heaven and a new earth. God does not have plan B outside of the participation of God's people. And you're part of that. You're part of that. You and I have been enlisted. Our baptism has claimed us to be part of God's work. And every one of us, without exception, every one of us has been included in God's great plan to save the world. Now, Moses begins fighting God over this, as we can understand, can't we? I mean, who says to God, when God comes and says, I have a plan, forget your plan, I have a plan for you. Who says to God, hey, thanks, God, I was waiting for you to show up. Give me the ball, I'm ready to go. I'm equipped, I'm ready, I'm absolutely qualified in every way. Just hand it over to me. None of us does that. What happens is that we begin this struggle. Can we let go of where we are and who we are? As Moses enters this dialogue with God, God begins to give witness. We're used to saying that we need to give witness. But here now, God gives witness. God gives witness to who He is, to Moses. And something new happens. This is not ordinary stuff. Something new in the world is going to happen now. Because in the ancient world, the gods are always on the side of the strong, the rich, the powerful. The gods of Egypt, the supreme God, the sun god of Egypt, who is all-powerful. Who does this God choose to be called Son of God? The king of Egypt. The most powerful person in the land gets the title Son of Ra, Son of God. God and the gods favor the strong. But now something happens that's new. As God begins to give witness to Moses, it's just the opposite. For God's witness to Moses goes like this. I have observed the misery of my people. I have heard their cries. I have seen their suffering. The world isn't used to that yet. That's God doing something new. And these people who've been in bondage, my goodness, how long they have cried. You know how many years? Does anybody know? Raise your hand if you know. How many years? 400 years. Bible student here in front row. I hope to be with you now for the rest of the calendar year. And 3 months from today, we'll start lighting an Advent candle wreath. You do that here? There will be 4 candles on the Advent wreath. Each candle representing 100 years of God's people waiting, crying, waiting. Is God ever going to answer? Have you ever asked yourself that? Have you been there with me? Have you been on your knees? Have you been in prayer to God? And you have prayed, and you have prayed, and now you stop praying and you wonder, is God ever going to hear my prayer? After 430 years, God sees and God hears. And now God is ready to act. I have to remind myself, and we remind each other today, when we wait for God, we can't wait too long. We keep waiting, and we keep praying, and we keep waiting, because when we wait for God, we can't wait too long. God sees, God hears, God knows the cries of God's people. And so now God witnesses to this new thing that God is going to do. God is going to send this ordinary person to the Son of God. God is going to send this ordinary person to the king of Egypt. God is going to send this ordinary person to free the slaves so they can go forth as God's new people on this earth. And Moses says, "Are you kidding me? You've chosen me? I'm not particularly gifted. I'm not particularly willing. I'm not sure I'm the right person. You've got to be kidding me. You've come here to ask me to do this." And so we have this wonderful interplay of this fight, this struggle between Moses and God. And if we're not struggling, if you're not fighting with God over this, I'm not sure you're taking it very seriously. This is a struggle of the soul. The struggle of our life to be able to give it away in order that we can find it again. This isn't easy stuff. This isn't easy stuff. And so Moses says to God, "Who am I?" And God doesn't answer that question. He doesn't say to Moses, "Well, you know, Moses, you're really pretty well equipped for this. You're an adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. You grew up in Egypt. You know the language. You know how to get around in Egypt. You know how to do this. You know the politics of the court." God doesn't say any of that. What God says to Moses is, "I will be with you." And that's all Moses needed to know. That should have been the end of it. I have called you, and I'm going to be with you. If God is with us, that's all we need to know. That's it. If God is with us. Or as the New Testament puts it, if God is for us, who's against us? Moses, you don't need to ask the question, because I am with you. And Moses isn't satisfied. The struggle goes on. He said, well, God, who are you? And this time God gives an answer to Moses. God says to Moses, which is actually the same answer as the previous one, God says to Moses, when you go, tell them I am has sent you. Which is kind of a shorthand way of talking. Tell them I am has sent you. So let's make it longhand. When you go to the people, when you go to Pharaoh, tell the people, I am with you whatever happens. Tell them, I am your guide, and I will walk with you and guide your steps. And when you fall down, I will pick you up. The conversation goes on. We didn't read the whole story. It goes into the 4th chapter, and Moses keeps coming up with these reasons that he can't do it. I don't have time. I'm not the right person. Who are you? And God keeps giving resources of assurance. Throw down your staff, and it turns into a snake. I will be with you to show wonders to Pharaoh. It goes on, and finally Moses says, he gets to the end of his excuses, and he says, you know, God, I can't even talk. I'm slow of speech. And I can almost hear God running out of patience. Not quite, but just about running out of patience. And he says, Moses, I will be with your mouth. And then he gives him Aaron, of course, to be a mouthpiece. And out of the struggle, when Moses runs out of excuses, he puts on his shoes. And he goes out for some impossible task. Some calling that God has placed in his life. 1517 is 500 years ago. Protestants right now across the world are celebrating the Protestant Reformation. It was 500 years ago that the monk, Martin Luther, nailed the 95 Theses on the church door, and the Protestant Reformation was sparked. And we're part of that. But you know what the best part of the Protestant Reformation was, I think? The very best part. It was the recovery of the biblical understanding of who we are. And it's in the words of priesthood of the believer. Which means the world isn't divided between holy and secular people. There aren't some people who are better because of whatever education or ordination or whatever they may have experienced, and normal, ordinary people in the world, that's gone. We've recovered what the Bible, the New Testament, has given us. The priesthood of the believer. Which means, of course, that we all touch each other to bring God's blessing. That the prayer of every person is equal. That we are all included. Nobody's left out. We all are included in this great task, this wonderful task of being partners with God and bringing forth a new heaven and a new earth. And so when we get finished with our fighting, we put on our shoes and we go out to whatever Egypt God has called us to serve. Amen.